A few years ago, my friend Lena and I set out on a cross-country road trip. We planned to drive from Boston to San Francisco, meandering through the heartland of America for 6 weeks. Both in our early 20s and scraping by, I remembered my own mom had once driven long-haul routes. To save money, I suggested we sleep in the back of our compact hatchback. We rigged up a cozy setup, picking up blankets and sheets from the Salvation Army, and even hacking one into makeshift curtains. By the end of our first week, we'd perfected our system. In about 10 minutes, we could pull over, shift our luggage to the front, hang our curtains, lay out our bedding, and settle in for the night. We parked in lots, camped on free sites and rest areas, anywhere it was safe and nearly legal. Every night, our journey was filled with unexpected encounters that made us feel welcome. We even shared a meal at a local diner in Nashville with a group of down-to-earth locals we met by a pickup truck. We bonded with an 82-year-old rancher who took us out for drinks and taught us how to line dance at a rural bar, strum guitar with some musicians during a sudden thunderstorm, and enjoyed hearty breakfasts and dinners provided by fellow campers. On the 4th of July, a kindly family invited us to join their campsite, and every stranger we encountered filled our journey with warmth. But one night in Arizona, near Sedona, the routine began to twist into something unnerving. We had found a free campsite on our phone and drove deep into the woods, far from any town. As we arrived, an RV was parked ominously among two other cars hidden among the trees. We pulled up near the RV, and a man opened its door. Lena waved cheerfully, yet the man merely stared blankly at her before slowly shutting the door, his gaze fixed on us, unblinking and unsettling. Shaken, we moved further down the road and chose a flat spot to park, postponing our usual immediate camp setup until daylight waned. While we lounged around, smoking and taking silly photos, Lena spotted a flickering campfire further along the clearing. Remembering how many friendly faces we'd met over the past weeks, we decided to join the gathering. There we encountered two men, the same ones whose cars we'd seen earlier. They seemed cordial at first. We sat down, shared a beer, and chatted about our travels. One of them, however, gave off a peculiar vibe. His odor and erratic behavior hinted at substance use, and he rambled about UFOs in a disjointed, circular fashion. Our conversation eventually shifted to the other man, a former forest ranger with a handsome, easygoing demeanor, who recounted his recent experience in the wild. After discussing our trip and personal lives for hours, he began telling us about a bear he'd seen in the forest. Lena scoffed at his claim until he pulled out his camera and showed photos of the creature alarmingly close to the campsite. The images sent a shiver down our spines. It wasn't unusual for one of us to wander off in the middle of the night, but the idea of a bear lurking so near was deeply unsettling. Then, his laughter died away and his expression turned ice cold. In a flat, chilling tone, he warned, "If you ever step out of your car in the dark, it's not a bear you should fear." I waited for a nudge or a joke about, say, local madmen, but he simply fell silent. I awkwardly cracked a joke about notorious serial killers in the woods, and Lena chuckled in response. But within minutes, the ranger circled back to his ominous topic, insisting there was something grabbing at our car if we ever left it in the dead of night. No matter how we tried to shift the conversation away from such grim ideas, he clung to them like a dark mantra. Soon, the older, erratic man drifted off into the shadows to fetch another beer from a cooler that lay outside our circle of light. Then, in the pitch black, a small red dot suddenly appeared in the darkness. It took a moment for me to register that it was a digital camera's indicator, a camera held by the ranger. I watched, horrified, as he adjusted his settings and snapped another photo, this time with a flash, without any request or explanation. We stood there, paralyzed like deer caught in headlights, as he returned to the fire without a word about what he'd done. Lena and I exchanged terrified looks and made a hasty excuse, claiming we needed to set up our own camp. As we began to leave, the peculiar man by the fire smiled and murmured a dismissive, "Good night, folks." But the ranger's smile was empty, and as we climbed into our car, he leaned in and whispered, "Be careful out there, there's more than just bears in these woods." Every hair on my arm stood on end. Lena, nearly hyperventilating, pulled me away from the unsettling campfire and towards our car. In our panic, as we fumbled with the headlights, fearing that our position might be compromised. I blurted out a half-formed warning about serial killer tactics that I'd read about. We both sat in stunned silence, the terror mounting with every passing second. We managed to locate our car in the darkness, by the dim glow of the RV, leaped into the front seats, and floored the accelerator down the dirt road. In our rearview mirror, the Ranger could be seen slowly trudging toward us, his expression as cold and unyielding as ever, a silent, haunting reminder of the horrors that lurk in the wilderness. I was 16 and on a road trip to Florida with my best friend Jade and my parents. We decided to spend the night at a budget motel in Lexington, Kentucky. We arrived around 10 p.m., and after spending the whole day cooped up in a car, Jade and I were still buzzing with energy. We wandered around the motel grounds until we ran into a group of guys sporting thick Texan accents. They fumbled through awkward teenage flirting, and I'll never forget Jade's quick excuse for not sharing her number. She claimed she'd accidentally microwaved her phone the previous month. We just laughed it off, convinced that was typical boy behavior. Later, still restless, we roamed the motel corridors and dared each other to race down the main hallway on the first floor, right beside the lobby. As we were laughing and sprinting down the hall, we burst past a room with its door wide open. In that split second, all I saw were countless shiny objects strewn across the floor and a huge, formless blob lying in the middle. When we reached the end of the hallway, we exchanged nervous glances, both asking, "What on earth was that?" Our curiosity got the better of us, so we crept back around the corner and peeked into the room. There, in the doorway, lay a very overweight man on his stomach, his chin resting on his hands, as if he were trying to appear endearing. But scattered around him were silver utensils and tiny metal trinkets arranged in a disturbingly deliberate pattern. When he noticed us, he fixed us with a bizarre, unsettling smile and shifted his torso slightly to get a better look, yet said nothing. Panicked, we bolted back to my parents' room, only to find they'd stepped out for a late-night snack. After trembling and awkwardly laughing about the situation for about 15 minutes, we decided to venture back down the stairway from the second floor. On our way, we bumped into that same group of boys. One of them, with a worried tone, asked if we'd seen the strange man. When we confirmed, he started to freak out, explaining that his little brother had been walking from the room on the far end of the first floor toward the vending machines when the odd man had called out to him, even offering him one of his creepy trinkets. The kid wisely declined, but the whole incident left us deeply disturbed. What was that man really after? I believe the motel manager eventually intervened, and the man slammed his door shut. I hope the boy's parents reported the incident or even called the cops. I was too young to fully grasp how twisted the whole encounter was, so to lighten the mood later, Jade and I dubbed him the Wriggling Kentucky Spoon Man. It became one of the wild, chilling stories from our trip, a tale no one at school would ever believe after break. A few years ago, I moved to Portland, Oregon for graduate school. Being new to the area and shy by nature, I spent my free time exploring the surroundings alone, or traveling up north to be with my fiancée. One long weekend, I decided to take a solo road trip down to the scenic southern coast of Oregon and do an overnight solo backpacking trip on a trail that had been on my wish list for ages. To clarify, I'm a small-framed woman, and I know full well that I'm vulnerable when I venture out on my own. However, I have extensive backcountry experience and have hiked numerous trails without incident, so I've always felt confident in my skills. That said, this time, I had a strange sense that something wasn't quite right. I left early in the morning to get to the trailhead before noon. After gathering my gear, I set off. It was in a national forest flowing along a gorgeous river, a place well known for outdoor enthusiasts like rafters and hikers. The familiarity of the area's popularity put me at ease, but physically, my body felt off, like I was being watched. I put it down to anxiety and brushed it off as first-time nerves in an unfamiliar place. The first few miles of my hike were peaceful and without incident as I passed a few groups heading back. The sun filtered through the trees, mixing with the river's bright blue below. Birds chirped above, and for a while, I felt more comfortable, if not completely at ease. My sole worry was avoiding the poison oak scrambling along the edge of the trail. But then I saw him. About 30 yards ahead, a man stood still, seemingly waiting. His eyes locked onto mine as I advanced. There was something about his intense gaze that immediately set off alarms, even though he moved aside when I neared and turned his back, as if tying his shoe. I breathed a little easier but couldn't shake the eerie feeling. I smiled and greeted him, but he acted surprised, exclaiming, "Oh, you caught me off guard," even though I was sure he had seen me coming from miles away. I tried to brush it off and answered his questions about my plans for the hike. He was older, probably in his mid-60s, with a shirt soaked in sweat and gray shoulder-length hair. His cheeks were flushed, a picture of heat exhaustion or perhaps nervous energy. As I stood talking to him, he stared at me in a way that made me feel like an object more than a person. His gaze lingered a little too much. I pieced out a few short, truthful answers, consciously leaving some facts out. When he asked about my family and my fiancée, I told him they were far away. He asked about my car and I reluctantly answered. It finally occurred to me that I should have been lying. Harmless questions became suspicious. Why did he need so much information? Panic began creeping up my spine. I tried to ease the tension by asking him about his hiking experiences, nervously listening as he talked about his retirement and hiking the South Coast. But after a long 15-minute conversation, I decided to excuse myself. He then said something that sent my heart into overdrive. "I'll be seeing you soon." My thoughts raced, and I felt like my legs were made of rubber as I continued my hike. I passed one group of hikers, but I no longer felt safe. Every nerve screamed at me to get off the trail. I couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't getting ready to finish his hike. Instead, I decided to take a detour, find a place off-trail to hide and observe. I ducked off the main trail onto a small path that veiled me from view, thrashing through poison oak and underbrush until I found a somewhat concealed spot between a few oak trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I dropped my gear and crouched behind the trees, trying to settle into a position where I could watch the trail without being seen. Sure enough, a few minutes later, I spotted him. He was heading back up the trail, walking briskly toward me, staring ahead with no sign of looking around. My worst fear was getting caught. I held my breath as he passed, but thankfully he didn't glance in my direction. I waited in a panic for what seemed like an eternity, but soon enough, I saw a group of hikers walking down the trail. I decided to follow them, keeping just enough distance to remain unnoticed but close enough for safety. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't waste time changing or unpacking. I just wanted to be far away from that trail, so I drove straight home. And while I emerged with only some rashes from the poison oak, the icy feeling of dread I experienced that day still lingers. For 56 seconds. In the spring a few years ago, I left my home in Minneapolis to attend graduate school in Seattle. Being new to the area and naturally introverted, I spent most of my free time exploring the nearby wilderness by myself, or driving a few hours north to visit my fiancée in Chicago. One long weekend, I decided to take a solitary road trip to the rugged northern coast of Washington and embark on an overnight backpacking adventure along a trail I'd long coveted to hike. I'm a slight, unassuming woman, fully aware that traveling alone leaves me exposed. Still, with years of backcountry experience and only pleasant encounters in the wild up to that point, I felt confident. I set off at dawn to reach the trailhead in the Olympic National Forest, where the path meandered alongside the glistening Solduke River. The route, popular with rafters and hikers alike, usually put me at ease. Yet that day, an inexplicable dread settled in my bones, a physical unease I dismissed as mere anxiety in a new, unfamiliar place. My plan was to camp about a mile along the trail. The first few miles were idyllic. Sunlight filtered through ancient cedars. The river flashed brilliant blue through breaks in the trees, and birds sang softly overhead. My only worry was dodging the clusters of poison oak that brushed against my legs. Then, as I rounded a bend, I noticed a man standing roughly 10 meters ahead. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and as I approached, he began slowly advancing toward me. When I drew nearer, he shifted off the trail and abruptly turned his back, bending over as if tying a shoe. Relieved at first by what I assumed was simple shyness, I greeted him politely. To my dismay, he feigned surprise, exclaiming, "Oh, you nearly caught me off guard," though I was certain he'd been watching me the whole time. He then inquired in a grating, almost predatory tone, "Where are you hiking today?" I replied, "I'm camping 8 miles up the trail with a big group tonight," adding, "I'm actually coming back from that direction." He was of average build, appearing to be in his early 60s, dressed in a faded blue t-shirt, smeared with sweat, his silver hair unkempt, and his cheeks flushed. As he appraised me, his gaze felt invasive, as if I were nothing more than an object on display. I nervously thanked him for the tip about the campsite, and he pressed on with more probing questions. "Where are you from? Who are you hiking with?" In a series of unguarded answers, I admitted that I was new to the area, originally from the Midwest, and that my family and fiancé were back in Chicago. When he asked if I knew anyone locally, I hesitantly said no. Then, as he inquired about my car and my solitary status, a wave of panic washed over me. I realized too late that I should have been more guarded. His questions were not those of someone with benign intentions. Desperate to break the conversation, I tried to ask him a few questions of my own, but he continued relentlessly. He mentioned he was a retired fisherman from the nearby town of Forks, and that he frequented trails along the northern coast. After about 15 minutes of unnerving banter, I told him I needed to go. He reminded me of the alternate campsite he'd recommended, and with a chilling smile, added, "I'll be seeing you soon." Shaken, I trudged onward until my legs grew weak and tears threatened to spill. Passing another group of hikers, I realized with a sinking feeling that I didn't feel safe at any of the designated campsites. A gut instinct screamed that this man wasn't heading back to the trailhead at all. I decided to veer off at a hidden bend, thrashed through dense poison oak and brush, and found refuge among a cluster of ancient oak trees that offered a secret vantage point over the trail. I dropped my pack and flattened myself against the rough bark, eyes fixed on the winding path. My heart hammered as I questioned whether I was truly concealed or if he might be watching me from the shadows. After about 10 nerve-wracking minutes, I saw him swiftly hiking back up the trail, his face set in an expressionless mask, oblivious to my desperate gaze from behind the trees. Panic and uncertainty surged as I contemplated my next move. Finally, I resolved to wait until another group emerged near the trailhead, someone I could safely follow out. After another agonizing 15 minutes, I cautiously descended the hillside toward my car. By the time I reached it, drenched in sweat and still trembling in my hiking boots and clothes, I didn't bother changing. I drove straight home, silently praying that all I'd taken away from that night was a rash from the poison oak and the lingering terror of that encounter in the woods. When I was younger, every summer, and at the start of nearly every new year, my family would load up the car and hit the road to visit relatives in Mexico. We'd never had any issues, until one trip when I was 8. As with our usual journeys, we left our hometown in Corpus Christi, Texas, around 6 p.m., planning to reach our destination the next morning. By about 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico near Matamoros, and that's when everything turned ominous. On that desolate stretch of highway cutting through the desert, darkness swallowed the landscape. Outside our car, only the scattered stars and the ghostly outlines of cacti broke the inky blackness. We had been in Mexico for roughly an hour, with several more miles ahead, and though I managed to drift into a light sleep, I remained half awake, unable to truly relax in the car. Then out of nowhere, I heard my mother's voice trembling as she called out to my father, "Diego, get that car off our tail. It's been following us since we left Brownsville." My father merely glanced at the rearview mirror and shrugged, insisting that many vehicles use that lonely road. Perhaps the car was bound for Monterrey or another nearby city, and brushed off her worry. But my mother couldn't shake her fear. Her eyes stayed fixed on that eerie vehicle. My siblings and I grew increasingly alert, our attention consumed by watching the car through the gaps in the luggage blocking our view. Soon my mother's anxiety peaked as the car drew ever closer, until it was nearly pressed against our bumper. There we were, hurtling along an isolated highway in the middle of nowhere with hours to go until sunrise. and the situation was utterly terrifying. There was nothing we could do. My father didn't slow down, stop, or even try to shake the tail. He simply kept driving. For the next 30 minutes, the mysterious car would ease off momentarily, its harsh headlights dimming for a few seconds, as if it were mocking us, only to surge forward again, relentlessly closing the gap. Then, during one of these brief lulls, my mother spotted a police cruiser parked by the roadside up ahead. "Pull over right in front of the police, Diego," she pleaded. My father obliged, parking our car directly in front of the cruiser. The officer approached, clearly puzzled by our predicament. In a frantic rush, my mother explained that a strange car had been following us ever since we left Brownsville, taunting us along the way. The officer listened gravely, recounting how drivers on these empty highways had often fallen victim to criminals who stole cars or set up ambushes. He even offered to escort us, driving behind our vehicle to ensure our safety. Relieved, we resumed our journey with the police cruiser trailing us. But about 10 minutes later, our relief shattered. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the mysterious car pull over on the side of the road, engine idling in the oppressive darkness as if it were waiting. In that moment, every chilling story the officer had mentioned, and every one of my mother's worst fears, crashed down upon me. In the summer of a few years ago, I was on a cross-country road trip with my co-worker Michelle. We were driving along Interstate 40 in southern New Mexico, a vast, desolate stretch, where a lonely gas station or truck stop appeared roughly every 100 miles. These weren't proper towns at all, just isolated exits with nothing more than a fading sign and a patch of asphalt. It was well past midnight, and Michelle had been at the wheel for about 4 hours. She couldn't go as long as I could, so it was my turn driving. Our fuel gauge was dangerously low, just a quarter tank remaining, and every seasoned road warrior knows to fill up at the first opportunity. We'd been discussing fate and destiny, a conversation that usually sent a shiver down my spine, and I was desperately trying to steer the talk away from the eerie as we searched for a gas station. Just then, Michelle took an exit off the highway. I grabbed my favorite coffee mug to fill it up, hoping to perk myself up for my turn behind the wheel. We pulled into a typical nowhere gas station, a lone building with a trailer parked out back and a beat-up car huddled near the service doors. We stepped out, still chatting softly, and made our way toward the double doors. To our surprise, the doors were locked. I glanced around for any signage when a series of unsettling details caught my eye. Inside, the coffee maker was midway through brewing a fresh pot of coffee, yet the store's security monitors, visible through the glass, were nothing but static. Then, my heart froze when I noticed a gruesome splash of bright red on the back door. A huge streak of blood laced with crude handprints. Every hair on my neck stood on end. Before I could react further, Michelle started checking the door, exclaiming, "We need gas!" But I couldn't ignore the horror before me. I spun around and pulled her toward the car, my heart pounding. That's when I noticed the other car in the lot. Its paint was chipped, dents marred its body, and an empty gun rack hung oddly in its window, as if it had seen better days. I dashed to our vehicle, dragging a hesitant Michelle along. She fumbled with the door for what felt like an eternity, all the while murmuring about needing gas, even as I tried to explain there was blood inside. Finally, she managed to get in, and as we backed away, I caught a glimpse through the rear window. The back door of the gas station was slowly creaking open. We had pulled away just in time, but the terror clung to us as we drove for about 20 miles down the lonely highway. I tried calling the police, but there was no signal. It wasn't until we reached a remote truck stop, just a solitary building in the middle of nowhere about 40 miles later, that I managed to get a connection. I reported what had happened, and the officer thanked me for my call, but I never heard any more about it. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that if I had hesitated any longer, we might have encountered the deranged criminal, or worse, lurking in that back room. I still wonder what truly transpired at that Shell station somewhere in eastern New Mexico. Out of all my eerie travel tales, this one remains the mildest, but even mild horror can leave a lasting chill. In 2002, I was living in North Carolina, and one summer, my friend Lily and I decided to take a road trip. It was our first time driving this far from home, and we were both 19. It was before we had smartphones with GPS, so we were navigating our way with paper maps. We had already missed a few rest areas, and my bladder was screaming for relief. Finally, we spotted a sign directing us to a rest stop just 2 miles ahead. We pulled off the highway around 10 p.m., and there were a few cars parked in the lot. After hopping out of the car and heading inside to use the restroom, we decided to grab some sodas and snacks from the vending machines, since we had another 25-minute drive before reaching the town where we hoped to get a hotel for the night. As we fumbled with the vending machines, we started to realize that the other cars and people had all gone. There were still a couple of truckers parked way off in the back lot, but they were far enough away we couldn't hear anything. It felt odd, but we didn't pay much attention to it at first. That's when we noticed a navy blue Chevy pulling into the lot. Initially, it was a small relief. At least we weren't the only ones still there. But then the truck parked right next to our car, choosing a spot when there were dozens of empty spaces available. Immediately, red flags went up. I tried to dismiss my unease, telling myself that there's safety in numbers. But even back then, we knew better than to park next to a van in a dark, empty lot. I made my way to the passenger side of the van, squeezing in between the truck and our vehicle, in a space far too tight. As I slammed the door shut, panic set in. I quickly fastened my seatbelt, turning to see the man from the truck at my window, standing far too close for comfort, with an unsettlingly wide grin on his face. I let out a small squeal and locked the door at once. His appearance reminded me of an older comedian with a dirty baseball cap, and he apologized for startling me. But his tone was strange, almost rehearsed. He said he was lost. Without thinking, I said, "Sorry, we're not from around here," hoping that would end the interaction. But he ignored my polite answer and casually asked if we knew how to get to some place near Petersburg. Lily and I exchanged a look, knowing that Petersburg was hours away in a direction we didn't even know. Still, he continued, asking for directions as if completely oblivious to the fact that we were offering no help. I admitted again that we were unfamiliar with the area, but he wouldn't give up. Then, in a sudden, shocking move, he slid his fingers into the door window crack and yanked at it as though trying to force the glass open. My heart pounded as Lily scrambled for the keys in her lap. In sheer terror, we shouted for him to stop. He didn't listen. Then, in a low guttural growl, he muttered, "I've drank blood fresher than yours." A sickening chill ran up my spine just as Lily started the ignition. She slammed the car in reverse, and he gave one final aggressive tug at the window. All I could think was that we needed to get out of there, and fast. We backed out of the parking space, him still gripping the window, and I forced my side of the window up, praying that he wouldn't follow us. Fortunately, he didn't chase us as we sped off towards the interstate, but we didn't stop to call the police or tell anyone. We were both too scared and felt irrationally embarrassed by the situation, not wanting to hear anyone say, "I told you so." But it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. To this day, I'll never know exactly who that man was or what he was planning, but I'm just grateful we made it out of there. For one M2S, in 1999, though I was originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, this unnerving incident occurred far from home, right in the rugged mountains near Linville. My friend Brooke and I, then 19, had set out on a long-anticipated road trip to explore the famed caverns of Linville. It was the first time either of our parents had let us drive so far on our own, and in an era before Google Maps or Siri, we navigated using only old-fashioned paper maps. We'd already missed several rest areas along the way, and by then, the need to pee was almost unbearable. Finally, we spotted a sign for a rest area, and as we pulled in around 10 p.m., a few cars were scattered in the lot. We hopped out of our van to relieve ourselves and grabbed some sodas and snacks from the vending machines, knowing we still had another 25 minutes of driving before reaching the town where we'd spend the night in a hotel. As we lingered by the machines, we soon noticed that all the cars and people we'd seen earlier had vanished. Only a few tractor trailers hummed far off to the side, their engines barely audible. Then, out of the darkness, an old navy blue Chevy slid through the entrance. At first, its arrival offered a glimmer of reassurance, but that soon turned into dread. The truck parked directly beside our van, ignoring the dozens of empty spaces around it, an unsettling choice that immediately set my nerves on edge. Even back then, we were taught to be cautious of parking next to vans in desolate, dark lots, and this truck's menacing presence on our passenger side made my skin crawl. As we walked toward our van, Brooke, who'd been driving earlier, murmured, "What do you think they're up to?" I found myself forced to squeeze between the Chevy and our van's door, with barely enough room to pass. I nearly froze, but managed to dart around the back and slam my door shut, as if expecting someone to grab me. Just then, as I fumbled with my seatbelt, a man leapt from the Chevy and stood in the narrow gap, pounding on our rear window. I let out a terrified squeal and locked the door in his face. He reminded me of Gallagher, the comedian known for smashing watermelons, but this man wore a grimy baseball cap and carried an air of quiet menace. He mumbled, "Sorry to scare you," before his voice lowered to a gravelly tone as he began rambling through the window's crack. "I'm lost. We're not from around here." Before I could muster a reply, he asked if we knew the way past Boone, a town nearly 80 miles off our route. Exchanging a panicked glance with Brooke, I stammered, "We're not from here, sir." "I'm sorry, we can't help." He gestured vaguely toward a large map posted inside the station and said, "That might help." Then, in a moment that still haunts me, he suddenly reached up and slid his fingers into the narrow gap of my window, yanking at the glass as though trying to shatter it. I can't explain how the window held firm, but in that instant, I was battling rising panic while scrambling to retrieve my keys from my lap. We both began yelling for him to stop. Then, as Brooke fumbled with the ignition and prepared to back out, he leaned in close, his voice a low, guttural growl. "I've drunk blood fresher than yours anyway." With one final, forceful yank, while his finger remained lodged in the window, Brooke managed to peel our van away from the gas station. We never saw him follow us, and we fled back toward the highway, hearts pounding. Terrified and shaken, we didn't report the incident to the police or our parents, fearing endless lectures on stranger danger. But I still shudder when I think back to that night. It was seriously creepy as hell. It was the summer, right after Independence Day, and my husband Daniel and I were in the midst of a cross-country road trip. We were barreling through the vast, barren stretches of southern Arizona, a region where, if you've ever driven through the state, you know that sometimes you go for hours without passing more than a lonely gas station or a scattering of dusty houses that look like they belong to the same endless desert. After several hours on the road, I started to get a headache. Daniel suggested I take a quick nap to shake it off. I dozed off, mesmerized by the brilliant hues of a desert sunset, only to be jolted awake by the car's slow deceleration. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was around 10 p.m. Daniel had pulled over at a Shell gas station, a small, isolated stop with a tiny convenience store. He said he'd get us some food and asked if I needed to use the restroom, knowing there might not be another chance for quite a while. Inside the store, I made my way down a short hall to the restroom. As I shuffled toward the nearest stall, I caught sight of a woman emerging from the adjacent stall. She didn't quite look homeless, yet her appearance was disturbingly unkempt. Her wild silver hair, almost shoulder length, sprawled in every direction as though it hadn't been brushed in weeks. She wore ragged, ill-fitting athletic shorts and several mismatched foam flip-flops, one of which was adorned with a garish purple and green pattern, while a faded jacket hung crookedly over her shoulders despite the summer heat. Clutched in one hand was a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I offered a tentative smile when our eyes met, but her expression soon shifted. Her face contorted into a wild, intense mask. Her eyebrows arched in anger, and her eyes fixed on me with a hungry, unsettling intensity. That was the moment I felt something was terribly off. Trying to shake the growing sense of dread, I hurried toward the sink and closed the stall door behind me. I lingered, too frightened to leave, listening for any sign that she had truly departed. I heard the soft, irregular smacking of her flip-flops as she moved toward the door. The door creaked open and slammed shut with a heavy thud, the same sound that had greeted me upon entering. I sat there for a long, agonizing moment, relief washing over me as I thought I'd finally heard her leave. But then, in the silence, I detected the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate breathing coming from just beyond the stall's gap. It was as if she had pretended to leave only to remain hidden, silently stalking the space. Panicking, I stayed in the stall for what felt like at least 20 minutes, straining to catch any further sounds of movement. When I finally heard the breathing cease and the soft rustle of footsteps recede, I quickly unlocked the door, washed my hands, and crept down the dimly lit hallway of the store. Outside, the darkness was impenetrable. I had no idea where she might be lurking. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left. Then I slipped out quietly behind him. Sure enough, right outside the front door, I saw her again. She stood motionless for a heartbeat, appearing startled as she quickly turned and walked briskly around the side of the store. My heart pounded as I rushed back to our car. Daniel was waiting, his face etched with concern as he asked if I was all right. I promised to recount the unsettling experience once we were safely away from that place. In the days that followed, online chatter offered several theories. Some said she was a drug addict out for mischief. Others claimed she was part of a mugging ring, or even involved in something far more sinister, like sex trafficking. I never discovered the truth, nor did I ever find any official news reports about that night. All I know is that the memory still haunts me, a chilling reminder of how quickly the mundane can turn into a nightmare on a lonely highway.